Welcome back to Science versus Conspiracy over coffee. I'm Conspiracy.
And I'm Science.
And today we're going to be talking about the electric car. But first, we got to talk about what kind of coffee we're drinking.
That's right. So once again today, we are having some Starbucks. Now, I am partial to that mocha frappuccino. So again, not an ad, but oh boy, yummy mocha frap. And it's been really nice and sunny today. Perfect drink on a hot day.
Absolutely. And I got another caramel frappuccino, which is awesome. And it was a surprise.
Surprise!
Brew yourself some coffee and pull up a chair. Science and conspiracy talk, electric cars over coffee. We'll be right back. The sales pitch that every Western politician is selling these days is that the electric car is the way of the future and the gas-guzzling vehicles are the scourge of the planet. We hear it all the time. We have to move to a greener economy before the world burns. It's a one-size-fits-all approach to a problem that scientists can't even agree even exists. In this last week, since Russia invaded Ukraine, crude oil prices have skyrocketed across the planet. These prices haven't been seen since the energy crisis of the 1970s. There are a number of factors contributing to the record high prices, especially here in Vancouver, where the price for a liter of gas has crossed the $2 mark, up from just $1.52 a month ago and about $1.70 at the beginning of the week. Some analysts are even predicting $2.50 by the summer. In Metro Vancouver, tax makes up 73 cents of every dollar.
I can't believe how quickly the price of gas is jumping. And it's not just happening here in Vancouver. I do have many people out in Ontario who have been sending me their gas prices as well. And although it hasn't quite hit $2 there yet, and I did see it max out at $2.09 today.
Wow.
In my drive to go get Starbucks, which makes me think twice. It hasn't quite hit that yet in Ontario, but they're quickly to follow, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with that being said, some analysts are predicting $2.50, $3 by the summer, which is absolutely insane. But here in Metro Vancouver, tax makes up 73 cents of every dollar of gas that you're putting in, which is
73 cents in taxes?
73 cents in taxes.
What a ripoff.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. So we're completely getting hosed. Yeah, and the government blames the oil companies for the price increases. They're being too greedy. Oil companies blame the government. Go talk to them, get them to reduce the taxes, and it's a big cycle, a big circle of confusion. And as usual, the taxpayer gets caught in the middle. We see environmentalists protesting pipelines and literally gluing themselves to the road to block traffic. Enter the electric car, a carbon-neutral and environmentally better alternative to the gas vehicle that uses up natural resources and destroys the planet, or so we're told. Electric cars use a clean, renewable energy source compared to the fossil fuels. Just plug in your car at night and you'll never have to pay to fill up again.
Or so they say.
Or so they say.
Ooh, I sound like I'm the conspiracy one now.
Well, I did a little digging, and I was amazed at what I found.
Do tell.
So, as you may or may not know, electric cars use a similar battery technology as your cell phones and other electronic devices, the lithium-ion batteries.
That's right.
And that's the key to all this. These types of batteries use a special makeup of chemicals that include graphite, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and nickel, among other things. The largest deposits of lithium and cobalt are located in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the world's poorest countries. Of the 250,000 people mining for cobalt in the country, 40,000 of them are children, and some are young as 6 years old, and they work in informal small-scale mines in which laborers earn less than $2 a day. and oftentimes they use their own tools and their hands as their primary tools.
Wait a minute. So 6-year-olds digging for cobalt?
Yes,
You're kidding me.
I wish I was.
Is that verifiable?
Yeah,
Wow.
and it gets worse.
Okay.
So compared to the heavily regulated oil and gas industry in our country, not only are there child labor concerns, there's also safety risks, environmental abuse, and corruption. If the Democratic Republic of Congo fails to adopt and enforce stricter regulations to improve these small-scale miners, the trend will increase alongside the technology-driven surge of the cobalt demand, and projected growth is 60% by 2025.
Wow. I saw that the mining is concentrated in the Congo, as well as Russia, Indonesia. So places where environmental oversight is often quite poor. Labor standards are really poor. I didn't know child labor poor in some of these cases, but certainly the mining industry also has a history of fueling, haha,
Yeah.
pun intended, conflict with local communities. And, I don't know if this is the right time to mention it or not, but do you know which country is second in the world for manganese ore?
Is it Chile?
No.
Because I got other stuff about Chile.
Okay. It's Ukraine. So I didn't know if you were going to be touching on that as part of the podcast, but
No, but that's really interesting.
yeah, there was unfortunately, it's one of those viral stories on social media right now about why Ukraine matters. I mean, Ukraine always matters, and it always will. But one of the posts, it delineated something like 30 reasons why this country should be saved, these people should be saved. And it's all been verifiable. There's some that are slightly out of date. They might have slipped a place here or gained a place there with respect to certain production. But overall, the post was pretty accurate. I read through a detailed breakdown of it. And so that was really wildly relevant right now, that Ukraine is second in the world for manganese.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, they're number one in the world for sunflowers and sunflower oil. And that's why their image that you keep seeing right now in the protest
Sunflowers.
political cartoons. And yeah. But anyway, so back to the mining practices.
Right, and also kind of relevant today too. Do you know what country owns most of the mines in the Congo?
No, but now I'm going to guess Russia.
Actually, China.
Oh, okay.
And the other big player in this whole game.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mining is overwhelmingly controlled by one single country, being China. Yeah, thanks to industrial policies, Chinese companies dominate the harvesting of the minerals necessary for EV production. As it sits right now, Beijing controls the EV supply chain and the wider industry. A concentrated supply chain puts the whole industry at risk.
For sure.
Yeah. In 2018, China accounted for more than 85% of the Democratic Republic of Congo's cobalt ore and concentrated exports by value.
Oh, wow.
Chinese companies own or invest in entities that own at least 12 of the Congo's mines of the cobalt reserves.
Wow.
Chinese companies also invest in producing or in processing the cobalt and the integrated supply chain around it. So all the vehicles and all the manufacturing equipment and all that kind of stuff, everything is owned by the Chinese government.
Interesting.
To make things worse, in 2016, a U.S. owned company in the Congo was sold to a Chinese mining company backed by the Chinese government.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there are other countries who have stakes in there who aren't China are selling their assets to China,
Yeah.
creating an even further centralization of these resources.
Wow.
Not to steer the whole thing away from the Congo with the child labor laws and everything and talking about China so much, but they're in there producing, enforcing these conditions, and they hold all the power. China also uses investments and strategic partnerships to extend its integration to foreign companies. They've established control over and influence on and access to many of the most promising EV startups. Chinese companies are also increasingly becoming the preferred vendors for many US, Japanese, and European automakers. These automakers include Volkswagen, Toyota, and Honda. So this brings us back to the carbon footprint that the environmental groups are always talking about. So Canada produces 1.2% of the total global CO2 emissions. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 5%. And the country is only 2.4 million square kilometers compared to Canada's just over 10 million square kilometers.
What? So they produce 5%?
Yeah, and we produce 1.2%.
Wow. Is that a current figure?
I think 2020.
Okay, wow.
Yep. So we're heavily taxed. Our oil and gas industry has been decimated by government policy when we're only producing 1.2% of the entire CO2.
And I don't know what's worse, actually, that we're taxed so heavily for something that we're barely even producing / contributing to in that sense, or the fact that the poor, literally sometimes poor, but I just mean like sympathy-wise, those poor people who are mining it and then being exposed to the noxious fumes are going to be reaping the health effects of this as well for our Western benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Canada, especially, like in Alberta, where the oil and gas industry was flourishing up until the government put in legislation and essentially killed it, it's one of the cleanest, most efficient oil producers in the world. So we're heavily regulated. Our standards are so high, and it created all kinds of high-paying jobs for Canadians. Then you look on the other side, and you have child slave labor for $2 an hour, producing other raw materials, other natural resources. And that's what I don't get too, is that cobalt and lithium and all these other minerals, there's not an infinite amount of resources. It's finite, just like they say gas is.
Yeah, it is. And actually, that's part of what I wanted to talk about. I don't know if you had plans to get there, about the recycling of it.
Yeah.
Do you have that? Okay, so we'll get to that.
Yeah, so as the demand for electric cars increases in the next 5 to 10 years, so will the demand on lithium and cobalt and all the other minerals. And they're saying by 2025 that the demand will outpace the supply. So
Wow.
we're gonna have a shortage in just a few years, according to the researchers.
Yeah. Do you know what the battery component is and what it looks like? Like we've talked about the ingredients, but did you know it's like a pack of cells? It's not like one big giant large battery.
Right.
It's actually literally thousands upon thousands of batteries bundled together in a casing. So, I mean, another thing that people don't think about is all the other raw materials that are used to go into the bundling, into the casing. And then going back to what you're talking about just now with the demand, these batteries are supposed to be warranted to last 5 to 8 years. Some companies warranty them for life, but there's a caveat that that's if it drains completely and doesn't recharge. But a lot of these batteries, when they reach the end of their life, there's still charge held in them. So they won't be covered under warranty because that's the fine print. And so, the batteries may only last 8 years, 100,000 miles. And that's not enough.
No, and right now, as it sits right now, the batteries, you can't just pull a battery out of a Tesla and slap in a new battery, and then you're good for another 10 years. The batteries are so integrated into the cars that once the battery starts degrading, you have to get rid of it. So the cars just become this, again, like a throwaway item. The recycling part of it, only a small portion of that battery can be recycled.
Well, yeah, and I definitely want to talk more about the recycling of the batteries. I don't know how accurate it is that the car, like, okay, you have to really deconstruct the car to get at the battery.
Right.
And Tesla, for sure, is one of the worst offenders for this. What I read was that, really politicians are pushing for the cars to be totally revised so that they can be easier to pull apart. But it's a very difficult situation because you have to ensure that there's nothing nearby that could spark. These things are highly flammable. I mean, as is gasoline, but, this is a very, very dangerous pursuit. And it has to be packaged up the right way. But yet cars like Tesla, they want to make it so aero that it doesn't fit the kind of more easily logistical requirements for taking it apart to change the battery, because they focused on the aero and the look of it versus the functionality.
Right, and that puts into question about the resale of the car.
Yeah.
Because right now there's a huge market for second owner vehicles, but you can't really do that with an electric vehicle. Like, they do sell them, but the battery life is so drastically reduced that you may only get maybe a year before you're trading it in again for another used EV.
Yeah.
Or by that point, you're probably going back to buy an electric or to a gas car.
Yeah.
So recycling these batteries for the cars is next to impossible, making it like affordable. So if you want, let's get into talking about the recycling bits of it, because other than that, that was just my notes on the recycling end of things.
Okay. So, feel free to interject wherever you have some commentary, but I'll just start talking about kind of some of the science behind the recycling, if that's okay. So, of course, they want to try to recuperate the valuable raw materials, if at all possible. Those materials, like you said before, nickel, manganese, cobalt, and lithium are the most expensive and valuable. It is an incredibly energy-intensive process to try to recover these materials in a usable form. So there's many, many facets to consider here. The extraction and use of these materials would be essential for a company to for their own carbon footprint, right? Because for it to be worthwhile and to be making these, for them to be able to extract and reuse some of these materials would only benefit them, because the materials are expensive to begin with, and as we know, they're not infinite, right?
Yep.
Not only that, the materials are hazardous, especially if mistreated, mishandled. Okay. So one of the theoretical ways that they can be recycled is the batteries are shredded and dried, and then essentially put through a big giant sieve to recover the valuable materials to make new batteries. Okay, so this black mass that they're left over with. But I mean, these materials, if they're disassembled incorrectly, can of course contaminate soil, contaminate water if they're disposed of improperly, and they're actually highly volatile and can explode.
Right.
If
That's nice.
I read this one interview with a scientist, and he used this great phrase: they have an inconvenient tendency to explode if disassembled incorrectly. Okay, so you cut too deep into a Tesla cell or in the wrong place, it'll short circuit, combust, release toxic fumes, right?
Right.
Tesla says none of their lithium ion batteries go into a landfill, and 100% of them are recycled.
But to what degree?
Well, that's excellent question. You're reading my mind. Because sure, you can recycle, air quotes, people, 100% of the batteries, but how much of that battery is recyclable? And it depends on how they're pulling it apart. Globally, it's very hard to get detailed figures for what percentage of the batteries are recycled. The value that a lot of the scientists are quoting is about 5% currently. That's brutal.
Yeah.
Right? Current EV batteries are not designed to be recycled. They were designed to be, the be all end all to saving the greenhouse gases and all this other stuff that you talked about at the beginning of the podcast. But they weren't designed to be easily pulled apart and recycled. So VW has a new plant that they built. Do you want to say anything about building a new factory?
Yeah.
Okay, so how many raw materials, resources, greenhouse gases are used up in building a new factory? Okay.
It's not built with clean energy.
Right? Right now, they claim that they can recycle 55% of the battery components in this plant.
Okay.
This plant is a trial test plant only. Their goal is to try and ramp that up to actually 97% of the battery's components. But, right now we're looking at about 50%.
Right.
It's a very, very small scale trial because it's very expensive process. Now, I'll come back to the process in just a second. But, again, we note the hypocrisy with having to build new factories. Okay. There's also the fact that you have to transport all these highly flammable, volatile batteries somehow, some way.
Are they being transported with an EV transport truck? Because there's not many of those right now.
I would doubt it.
So you need fossil. So you're saying you need fossil fuel vehicles to transport the electric vehicle batteries to get recycled,
right? And the high cost of transporting these combustible items, long distances, often discourages the recycling, as well as many of them will have to cross borders, and nobody here can completely comprehend. I know I can't. The amount of bureaucratic paperwork that would have to go into transporting highly combustible materials over borders. Okay?
Yeah, and the safety of the driver transporting them.
Oh my God. I mean,
that can't be cheap.
And not only that, we have that horrific example of what happened when a driver falls asleep behind the wheel of a transport truck. For those of you who don't know about the really tragic accident in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, where essentially a whole hockey team of teenagers was either seriously maimed or killed because a transport driver fell asleep behind the wheel.
Right, and smashed into the bus full of the hockey players.
Bus full of hockey players. But I digress. I mean, but safety is another issue for sure, right? So, they have to build new factories. It's not easy to do this. And of course, if they do end up in a landfill, which, Tesla claims will never happen, but there's also all these other companies making electric cars. Tesla's not the only one. But, if they end up in landfills, toxins, heavy metals can be released.
Yep.
So, just another quick note, Renault and Toyota and Nissan are all working on ways to also recycle the batteries. So they don't necessarily all involve, shredding down the battery. Some of them are repurposing them, because I guess what happens when it will no longer give off a charge, it can still hold a charge.
Right.
So they can be used as energy storage.
Right.
And so some of these companies are trying to use it in that way, even harnessing solar power into these cells, which can then be pulled out in another way. I don't know how, because I didn't read that far into it. So they are trying to figure out different ways.
Right, but you can't keep going on using the batteries for energy storage. At some point, you're going to have too many.
Oh, exactly. And at some point, they're still going to get used up and become dead.
Yeah.
Right? And so, okay, going back to what you said before about how the batteries are often made up of different chemical components. It's very difficult to create efficient recycling systems because of that.
Right.
So does that mean we're going to have like 1,000 different factories to deal with 1,000 different kinds of batteries made by 1,000 different companies?
Yeah, because if there's one generic factory and they're getting Toyotas and Teslas and Fords and whatever else, identifying the battery, and then it's got to go into stream 1, stream 2.
But guess what? Manufacturers are currently not required to disclose the type of battery in there. So yes, we have, lithium ion, but there's all kinds of different components that are making up these EV batteries. So unless the chemical composition is closely monitored and detailed on the battery, but manufacturers aren't required to disclose that currently.
Wow.
So you could be getting a whole bunch of different batteries at a battery recycling plant, and they wouldn't know what to do with it, which then brings up a couple of different scenarios, because you don't want to just go shredding some of these because they can explode.
Right.
Right. It's going to be less efficient, more expensive, and potentially way more hazardous. Okay, so the battery cells are generally bundled together and then in the casings, but they're held together with a really tough glue. Hands cannot easily take them apart. Robots cannot easily take them apart, because one small misstep, one cut the wrong way, and things will explode. So there's a huge economic obstacle here that battery makers are almost incentivized to buy freshly mined minerals rather than going through the process of trying to recover them.
Wow.
So there's kind of two, I'm not an engineer here, okay, folks, but there's two processes: pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy. And pyro, the stem means fire. Hydro, the stem means water. So you can guess where I'm going with this. They either break the batteries down by like melting them in a safe way,
Right.
or they blast water at it and it breaks down. But both are extremely expensive, create extensive waste, and guess what? Emit lots of greenhouse gases
Dun, dun, dun.
in the process. Okay, so there's so many problems here that people don't realize. There's another way. A company has created a solvent that they try to pour over the battery to dissolve the binding.
Right.
And It is so toxic that the European Union introduced restrictions on its use, and the US EPA said that it poses an unreasonable risk to workers. So that's not happening.
Wow.
So it's like, okay, either kill your workers or maybe accidentally kill them by blowing them up, or emit all these greenhouse gases by trying to break it down by pyrometallurgy or hydrometallurgy. So yeah, this financial incentive is looking less and less for them to try to recover it. Would you agree?
Yeah, and paying the miners $2 an hour or $2 a day, it's a deal.
Now here's another wrench in their plans.
Okay.
Automotive wrench, get it?
Yeah. Good one.
Come for the science and conspiracy, stay for the puns.
We're here all week.
So, Tesla has already said they're trying to get a way to build these without cobalt because they know there's a finite, they haven't, I don't know if they've acknowledged what goes on in the DRC, but, they're trying to build it without cobalt.
They get it from a Chinese company, and that's as far as they want to ask.
Yeah, right? But, here's the thing. Because so many of them are trying to shift away from cobalt because of the practices, because of how expensive it is, we could end up with a whole bunch of batteries in the near future that are redundant, that can't be recycled into new batteries because the science is moving on. They're trying to move away from using cobalt, but there's still going to be all these batteries that are currently being made and being used with cobalt. So that's not going to be a financial incentive at all.
No, we'll put those batteries with the expelled nuclear rods.
Right. Yeah.
'Cause that's clean too.
Yeah. So, cathode manufacturers today might not be able to find a future buyer, right? So this stuff's all going to end up in the landfill. One guy said recyclers would be trying to recover a dinosaur eventually.
Yeah.
Like no one's going to want to recycle those batteries. So that's a big problem. If you wanted to try to break them down by hand, I'm talking with the financial aspect here. I know it's about the process of recycling, but I did say earlier about, robots or people doing it. It takes more than 2 hours to break down a Nissan Leaf battery.
2 hours.
By hand. Yeah. So, and the Tesla batteries are bound with like an almost indestructible polyurethane cement.
Wow.
So there is a Chinese company. So I was listening really closely earlier when you were talking about the Chinese control over a lot of these products and their distribution, because there's a Chinese company that's been making the EVs, the EV batteries, that they're trying to make them a little differently. And
How so?
But they're trying to make them like a Christmas cracker where you can kind of like pull the ends apart and the casing falls away and the middle is exposed.
Okay.
So without fighting with wires and glues, it would be much more efficient. But the reason why China is pushing so hard to try and come up with ways to recycle these is because their law mandates that the manufacturers themselves must find ways of recycling.
Right.
So they're really controlling it, really trying to, I don't know if that's like a conflict of interest or good practice. I haven't thought that one through yet. What do you think?
Yeah.
But while the Chinese manufacturers are being tasked with finding ways to recycle them, both the US and the UK have been talking about whose responsibility it is to ensure the recycling.
Yeah, they're making it the manufacturers, aren't they?
Yes, but some suggest it should be the onus of the owner.
What?
Because you're the one buying the car. Just like right now, if you and I have, an old battery from our car, we have to find a way to safely dispose of it. If we take it to the dump, we have to pay those fees to take it to the dump. So You know, certainly there's talk about making it the owner's cost. So that will change the market drastically if that happens, because like, are people going to want to have to pay that extra price too?
That's going to be included when you buy it.
Yeah, it's going to jack up the cost, isn't it?
And all these are going to jack up the cost if the recycling part of it is such a huge cost and time consuming process. That's all going to be passed on to the consumer. So the price of the EV today, I'm not sure what the Teslas are, but they're around 40,000
Yeah,
plus.
something like that. Yeah.
It's going to jump to 60, 70,000 for a basic EV car.
I mean, yeah, if you think about the cost of the materials, the cost of transporting the materials, the cost of transporting the batteries once they need to be recycled, the cost of breaking down the batteries, that's all going to have to be passed on to the consumer if the consumer isn't the one themselves paying for the recycling.
Right. Yeah,
So
it's going to be
it's going to cost them either way.
yeah.
You know, as you can tell, dear listener, there's a lack of clarity over what the various, I mean, we've talked about so many different governments today. There's a lack of clarity. This one scientist in the UK said, like, the EU lacks any national or union strategy on what to do with them. It's clear that the manufacturers have just been pushing them out without clear guidance and regulation, other than cut carbon from the cars, like cut carbon emissions. That's the only guidance they've been given.
Yeah, the government seemed to have this bias against anything that related to gas. And we didn't even get into powering these things.
Yeah.
It's just the storage and the manufacturing of those batteries. But you got to look at where, just because you plug it into your car, into your home, that electricity's got to be made someplace. And more often than not, it's not made by clean energy. It's made by coal and other resource heavy processes. Is especially here in Canada, in BC especially, we don't have the sun to create solar power. I know there's some hydro electric dams and powered generation that way. A lot of it's still coal that produces some of these CO2 emissions that down the road,
Boom.
which plug into your car.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost you. And don't think for 1 second that once these electric cars become kind of the mainstream and the majority, that the government isn't going to tax the electricity that's plugging in, like how the gas cars are being taxed with the carbon tax, because right now they're not paying for the road maintenance and all these other government programs that the general revenue that the car taxes go into. They're going to be charged at some point. They're going to be taxed like regular cars are now.
Oh, exactly. And, you know, we're talking about all these things that we haven't even really touched on. Well, another thing is heat. What happens when you have a battery that overheats?
Well, it's going to explode.
Right. So the optimal temperature for these batteries is like 70
Right.
or something for these battery packs.
Well, that's great in California.
Oh, I was just gonna say, where's Tesla headquarters, Bob?
Actually, they're in Texas now.
Oh, are they? Well, it still
moved.
gets pretty darn hot there too, doesn't
Yeah.
it? I couldn't remember honestly if it was California or like Arizona or something.
They left California because of the taxes.
Ah, okay. But you know, here's another thing. The battery packs in these EV cars need to have a liquid cooling system.
Right.
How do they get the liquid coolant? What is it made out of?
Yeah, and I heard there's a software update over their Christmas break with the Teslas that on a large number of the vehicles, the internal heating system failed. And
Oh my God.
And these were reports of people in Saskatchewan in December and January. And for those of you who don't know, Saskatchewan gets very cold.
Very cold.
Like minus 40, 50 degrees is common. And you kind of need some heat in your car. And if these manufacturers are pushing software updates and it kicks out your heating, that's kind of a problem. Not to mention making all the systems run properly at those extremely low temperatures. It's crazy.
Another thing, as we touched on a little earlier about the health effects, when you said about these young children digging for cobalt, that horrifies me on so many levels.
Oh, absolutely.
Not only the child abuse being subjected to that and the child slave labor, but the long-term impact on these kids. And so I think we should talk for just a quick second before we wrap up here about the health effects of what would happen if you were in enough contact with some of the components. We know there's nickel in it, right? So people who are exposed to nickel at sufficient enough amounts and duration, lung cancer, nasal cancer.
Didn't we talk about this in one of the other podcasts about the green children?
That was copper.
Oh, copper. Sorry.
But yeah, isn't that funny, eh? If you haven't heard that podcast yet, folks, go listen to it. It's really cool. That was the one on time travel. Or no, not
parallel universes.
Sorry, parallel universes. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you there.
No worries.
Just some of the effects that I could possibly be happening.
Yeah. So, nickel's a carcinogen and has respiratory damage. Manganese, I have to say, both manganese and cobalt are found in very, very small amounts in the human body. That's normal. There are uses for it in very small amounts. Incorrect exposure to manganese, actually, there's a term for the syndrome. It's manganism.
What's that?
And it is essentially like getting Parkinson's disease.
Oh, God.
Tremors, ataxia, which is difficulty walking, like an uncoordinated gait, facial and muscle spasms. So it's essentially the tremors and Parkinsonian syndrome.
Wow.
So that's manganese. And then cobalt. Cobalt in very small amounts is proper, especially for actually our red blood cells. It's a good thing. It's in part of B12.
Okay.
But too much cobalt that these poor little kiddos are obviously being exposed to as well as everybody else. It's cardiotoxic. So like for your heart, you get cardiomyopathy and congestive heart failure. It's hepatotoxic, which means your liver. It's toxic to your endocrine system. So these kids aren't going to grow properly.
Wow.
Of course, with all three of these, the cobalt, the magnesium, or manganese, and the nickel, you get skin rashes and neurological decline with the cobalt as well, and increased mortality in infants who may be exposed. I mean, with all of these, really. But the neuro and cardiac toxicity is terrifying. Wow. So, were these batteries to end up in landfill? That's my point.
It's going to have a lot wider range
repercussions.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If it gets into the groundwater, we're screwed. So governments must come up with a clear strategy. I'm not anti-electric car. To be honest, I haven't really come to a conclusion on whether or not I would support them. Right now, I absolutely love my Jeep. So I don't want to get rid of my Jeep. My Jeep is gasoline based. I ain't getting rid of my Jeep. But, so I don't want it to come off like I am anti-EV. But, the science is clear that so much more needs to be done for the regulation, for the recycling. So much more that we still have to talk about, of course, but I don't know. I think they rushed it.
Yeah, I think so too. They're pushing this green agenda and the electric cars, and that's the savior. Gas is bad, and they're glossing over the important details, I think, that need to be talked about before we can go forward with this technology, because maybe there's something else out there that can better replace the gas-powered car.
Yeah.
We don't know, because we've been pushing for these ion lithium batteries, and that's the end-all be-all. And there's going to come a point in time when these resources are going to become scarce again, because...
Well, Putin's blowing them all up right now in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know for sure where the manganese reserves are centralized or located or anything like that. Geography fails me. Obviously, he's focusing on invading the cities, and it's such a disgusting humanitarian crisis that it upsets me. But, you know, like, what happens, just say, if he's out there, well, not him, but, you know, his troops are bombing away and NATO hasn't closed the airspace. So if they're bombing away, and what if they do encounter where these manganese stores are? That's neurotoxic.
Yeah.
Blown up for all these Ukrainians to start inhaling.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So, I mean, governments really need to get their act together on what they're going to do about electric cars, not just pushing the green agenda. They really need to figure out what they're going to do with the batteries, if this is the right choice going forward, before it's too late.
Yeah, because by 2025 and by 2030, there's all kinds of targets that governments are required to meet, and self-imposed requirements.
Yeah.
Come hell or high water, they're going to be making these changes. This podcast is being recorded on March the 4th, and here in BC, next month, April 1st, our carbon tax is being increased again. So it may only be 1 cent, but that's 1 extra cent that is unnecessary.
Yeah, and given that our gas is now over $2,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous.
So what do you think, everybody?
Yeah.
Is the electric car the green savior, or should we stick with gas or something else?
Yeah, what's another option? What are we not considering? What should we be looking into?
Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be talking about... It's a surprise. You have to wait and see.
Yeah, it all depends on what the state of the world is, too, in the next week. So everybody stay safe, take care. And again, I'm Science.
And I'm Conspiracy. And being paranoid is smart. See you next time. If you like the episode, don't forget to subscribe. You can download us on any of the major podcasting platforms. This week's episode of Science vs. Conspiracy over coffee was produced by Lethologica. Writing and research was done by Bob Homer and Jennifer Timer.